In this video, what I want to do is discuss a little bit more about the state under liberalism. In the last video, we looked at the various principles and general objectives of the liberal state, and we went into a lot of detail there. Well, in this lesson, we're going to look at what these principles of the liberal state, the theory behind the liberal state, actually looks like in practice. So, what does it actually entail when we talk about the objectives of the liberal state? Don't forget, in the last video, the objectives of the liberal state were discussed quite extensively. We have things like government, so we have things like government by consent. Government by consent. You have things like the equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity. And we also have things like justice. Now, there were obviously other ones, like a rejection of the traditional style of government and a number of other things as well, things like meritocracy and the promotion of toleration. Well, how do these objectives actually apply to the practical policy of creating a state? Well, when we look at this, we will find that the liberal state entails three distinct properties. There are generally three properties that are associated with the state under a liberal regime. And this is the first one being constitutional or limited styles of government. The second one being a system of fragmented government, which also entails a separation of powers. A separation of powers. And then the third one is the promotion of formal equality. And also this entails the rule of law. The rule of law. And so what we're going to do for the rest of this lesson is discuss what these three things mean. And of course we're going to begin with the idea of constitutional or limited government. As already discussed, liberalism holds the view that the social contract between government and the people ought to be presented in a formal constitution. Okay, this is the liberal interpretation of constitutionalism. So in a formal constitution. So the liberal representation of constitutionalism. Now, effectively what this means is when we have a system of government by consent, the objective of government by consent, we are consenting to a relationship between the people, us as individuals, and the state and the government. And this can be represented in the form of some kind of social contract. And as we know that Jacques-Jean Rousseau is someone who talks about the social contract in quite a lot of detail. Well, according to the sort of liberal framework, this social contract, this relationship between government and the people, and the way in which this contract operates is something that should be presented in a formal constitution. And that it shouldn't be something that is developed overnight. The constitution of a state should be developed by extensive debate and consensus. So it should be something that is agreed upon by all. Okay. Now, generally speaking, this idea of constitutional government implies an idea of limited government. So, by limited government, what we mean is that the Constitution should put restrictions on the rules for governing. There ought to be restrictions. There ought to be restrictions on how a government should be able to operate. That's what the government by consent social contract theory means. So if we're going to contract with the government, we're going to form a social contract whereby we are giving up some of our liberties, and these are the liberties, with relation to following the law that the government creates, for example. There also should be, on the other end of that, on the receiving end of that, there should be a general view that this contract limits the government's power. And that's what the constitution of a state will do. It will limit how much power a government has. Moreover, a constitution should be in place to protect the natural rights of people who are to be the governed. And this is what we find in things like the United States, so the US Bill of Rights, for example. So the US Bill of Rights, which, as we know, is the first 10 amendments of the United States Constitution. Ingrained within the Constitution are a set of rights to protect the natural people from the government. And this Bill of Rights does imply, it does add restrictions on government. It does imply a form of limited government because, for example, the United States government does not have the ability, it does not have the power to, for example, take away people's guns, because that is protected under the Second Amendment. So that's the restriction on that. We also have a restriction on the government being able to restrict freedom of speech as well. The government cannot for example, subject an individual to cruel and unusual punishment, because that's also a constitutional amendment. And there's also the 10th Amendment when we're talking about the relationship between the states and the federal government. So we can see here that the theory behind it is that the Constitution should be, one, a contract between the people and the state, an agreement for how things are supposed to be run. Okay. Number two, this agreement has to be something that is extensively debated and discussed, and something that will require mass consensus. And three, this constitution should embody a form of limited government. It should put restrictions on the rights of the individual, on the rights of the government, to allow for the best, to allow for the greatest amount of individualism and the greatest amount of flourishing of natural rights. A second point that we need to talk about is the concept of fragmented government. And this is another feature of the liberal state, the idea of the fragmentation of power. And the motivation for a fragmented state comes from the desire for limited government. Again, it ties into the constitutional argument, so the idea of constitutionalism as well. Constitutionalism. Okay? And as we already know from other lessons, Lord Acton from 1834 to 1902 argued and made the point that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the idea of absolute power is something that is not desirable. So absolute power is not a good thing. So absolute power is equal to not very good. So not very good. So by this logic, if absolute power corrupts absolutely, then it should be noted that this isn't just absolute power bestowed upon to one person. For example, if a monarch, for example, had absolute power, then that would corrupt that person absolutely. But it could also be bestowed upon institutions. If one government institution had absolute power, then that's also a bad thing. So by this logic, no one institution of government should hold absolute power. So this gives us the concept of the fragmented government, and it's best represented in the notion of the separation of powers. So the concept of fragmented government implies that there ought to be a separation of powers. So fragmented government implies a separation of powers. A separation of powers. And so that's what we're talking about here. Okay. And obviously, again, if we're going to refer back to the United States Constitution, a constitution that was developed using very strongly on the basis of liberal ideas, the concept of separation of powers in the United States entails that the powers of institutions are kept separate. So in the United States, there is a clear and distinct separation between the legislature, which is represented in at a federal level, is represented in Congress. Okay, the executive, which is represented at the federal level as a president, in the president and the White House, and the judiciary, which at the federal level is the circuit courts and also the Supreme Court for one. Let's just write the Supreme Court. But not only have we got this horizontal separation of powers in the United States, so not only do we have this traditional view of there being a separation of powers that looks like this, so we have an executive branch, we have a legislative branch, and we have a judicial branch. Okay. Not only do we have this at the federal level, but then there is also a separation of powers at the state level. And then we could go even further, we could go down to the local level. So not only do we have this, what is known as horizontal separation of powers, powers are separated at a federal level, but they're also vertically separated. We also have vertical separation of powers at state and local levels, to the point where states have the ability to prescribe legislation and rules and court rulings as well that don't necessarily apply to the federal government, and vice versa. So that's why separation of powers is very important, because it allows for the fragmentation of government. So now, in a situation like the United States, there is no one institution that has absolute power, because we also have checks and balances across each of them, which keeps them in check. You are kept in check by the checks and balances system between each institution, so it's a very balanced system. The final point I want to talk about is the concept of formal equality. And as we looked in a recent video, liberals believe in what is called foundational equality. And foundational equality is the view that everybody is born with equal rights. You are born, you have the equal right of somebody else who is born. And this implies that the liberal state ought to reflect this. So it's a very key concept within liberal philosophy, the idea of foundational equality, and so therefore liberalism should be able to transcribe this idea of formal equality into its state practice, and as such, a liberal state really should embrace what is known as the concept of the rule of law, and the rule of law. We have a number of videos on this channel actually about the rule of law, specifically theoretically the rule of law when we're talking about jurisprudence, and then also some of the more conceptual ideas of the rule of law in the United Kingdom. I'll link some in this video at the bottom of the video as well. But generally speaking, the rule of law holds that the law should apply to everybody indiscriminately. So that it shouldn't apply to one person and not somebody else, or it shouldn't apply more to one person and not somebody else. Therefore, no one is outside of the law, is one of the points that ought to be made, and also nobody is above the law. And this really does challenge the view that we have in the United Kingdom, where we have a hereditary monarch who is said to be above the law in some cases. And that's a very interesting point that needs to be made. It makes us all very uncomfortable in the United Kingdom if we're going to uphold the rule of law, but also uphold the institution of the monarchy, something that is, very complicated, controversial topic that I'm really not going to get into here. Moreover, fundamental political rights and personal rights also should be protected. Again, this is something that we looked at just a little bit earlier on when we were talking about constitutional government, the idea of natural rights. The natural rights. Some things like the freedom to hold political power. Everyone should be allowed to hold political power. Okay, and things like the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression, etc., etc. So with these three principles, we find that we have a very good representation of what a liberal state looks like. We have a state based around a constitution, which sets out the relationship between the people and the state. That constitution also limits the powers of government, okay, and protects the natural rights of individuals. The idea of a limited government also is implied through the concept of the fragmentation of government and the fragmentation of power, and this is represented practically with the separation of powers, and as we looked at here. And then finally, the states should be able to uphold things like the rule of law to really best bolster the foundational equality that is something that is very very important to the liberal project.